Abraham is preserved. Its original language doesn't have to be the Old Slavonic Russian language whatsoever. It just happens to exist in that language. You see how that works? Rather, they examined the book carefully for clues to the language of its composition. Jodl made the very sensible and perfectly obvious observation that Abraham was a Semite whose native language would have been Semitic, of course. Much of the material in the book of Abraham has nothing to do with Egypt. Further, I believe that a careful study of the book of Abraham itself would more than likely highlight the book's profoundly Semitic character. And I happen to absolutely agree with Kevin on this. The Semitic aspects of the book of Abraham are really powerful. This is true, and we're finding more and more every day. There's some good material in this book on just that topic. So, the theme of the book of Abraham in the 1912 situation, they thought they finally ended the book of Abraham, and of course that was going to destroy the church, and of course nothing like that happened. And then the same thing came along again in 1967. See, the Lord, it seems, keeps bringing these things to our attention because we're supposed to pay attention to them. We, of course, blithely ignore them and seek after the treasures of the earth, the money. You know, we would rather take courses in business management and stock market than we would in ancient scriptures and modern-day prophecy. I guess we'll remain forever in trouble and ignorant if we don't start paying attention to these things. That's why I'm bringing them out with Kevin Barney's ideas. Now, Kevin says, if Abraham composed his book of Abraham, the original text, of course, derives from Abraham, and it has been copied, then Abraham may have composed the text in a Semitic language. We don't know if that was an East Semitic language, some form of Akkadian perhaps, or a West Semitic language, probably an early Canaanitish dialogue. We don't know. We know that Hebrew wasn't composed then, so it wouldn't have been in Hebrew, of course. Between the time of Abraham's composition of the text in the early 2nd century BC or 1st century AD, papyrus copies that later would come into Joseph Smith's possession occurred, and therefore there was a transmission of the text. Now, this is an intriguing possibility. This may have included different versions, of course, from a translation from the Egyptian, as far as that goes, or possibly other languages. Hebrew by that time would have been an occurrence. Scribal copying and possibly redaction of the text could have occurred. And then, of course, the facsimiles may not have originated with Abraham. They would have become associated with the book of Abraham as part of the redaction and transmission process of the text. If this idea is correct, that Abraham originally copied his text, of course, and then it was transmitted through the generations down into the Greco-Roman period, then that explains a lot of the interesting peculiarities that we have with the book of Abraham. However, and I think Kevin's largely right here because I'm even been guilty of this myself, we are myopically looking at the aspect that we have to connect Joseph Smith's interpretations of his ideas of the facsimiles with what modern Egyptologists think. And this may be very incorrect, and here's why. If this text was originally written by Abraham, and then came down through the centuries through Jewish hands, and an Egyptian Jew brought in Egyptian material in the text of the book of Abraham, what did it mean to him is the significant question, not what it meant to modern Egyptologists. The idea is, what the facsimiles meant to modern Egyptologists and what they could have meant to an ancient Egyptian are both very important questions, of course, and it's necessary to ask and study along these lines must continue. Nevertheless, what represents the ultimate question, and this is significant, is if we try to match what the facsimiles mean to modern Egyptologists, then we are accepting the assumptions of Spalding in 1912. Because the fascinating thing is, the assumption is, Abraham drew these facsimiles in Egypt in an Egyptian language. But what if Abraham didn't draw the facsimiles? There's the question. What if they were added later on? Now this brings in interesting situations here. Even though Abraham, what if they already existed and they were either adopted or adapted by an Egyptian Jew into an already existing book written by Abraham? How does this change the nature of our position? Here's how it works. In this case, the facsimiles would have both an Egyptian context, of course, because they reflect the religious purpose for which they were originally created by one of the ancient Egyptians. And it also has a Semitic context, because an Egyptian Jew took the Egyptian materials and adapted it to a Semitic book of Abraham to illustrate what this ancient Jewish person in the Greco-Roman period thought was significant in the Egyptian documents. That's why he used them in the text itself. The question is not what do the facsimiles mean to modern Egyptologists. The real question is, what did the facsimiles mean to an ancient Egyptian Jew who brought them into the book of Abraham? Because it was the ancient Egyptian Jewish redactor who thought he saw parallels with this particular text of Abraham. So what would it mean to him, not necessarily the modern Egyptologists? We have a tendency when looking at the facsimiles to think that Abraham was well-schooled and articulate in the Egyptian religion, as if he was some sort of an Egyptian priest. But this is only our assumption. And it's very interesting. We know that he studied astronomy and he taught astronomy to Pharaoh and so on and so forth. But we don't really know what he was teaching as far as the details and intricacies of an Egyptian religion. He was Semitic. And the redactor of the book of Abraham that possibly adopted the facsimiles into the book of Abraham was also a Semitic Jew. As part of the redaction of the text from our redactor, our hypothetical Egyptian Jewish redactor, as he adopted or adapted the vignettes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead into this book of Abraham, he also used a hypocephalus. And these were illustrations for the book of Abraham. So in co-opting the papyri for this type of a use by this Egyptian Jewish redactor, the person interpreted them in accordance with Semitic sensibilities and the religious requirements of the Abraham story. He wasn't adapting these Egyptian documents as an Egyptian. He was adapting these Egyptian documents as a Semite. And that might very well be the actual context that we have to look for in order to understand the relationship with the facsimiles in the book of Abraham. Now, I think this is very interesting because we have historical precedents for just this type of activity from Jews in the Greco-Roman era, and Barney brings this out. What this means for our particular research and analysis is that the Egyptian materials in the facsimiles have been refracted through a Semitic prism. And it's only by viewing the facsimiles through a Semitic lens that we can clearly see how the explanations relate to the actual figures. That's why it's not necessarily critical to make sure the interpretations fit with what modern Egyptologists think about the ancient Egyptian documents, because this has been adapted by a Jewish Semitic Egyptian person for Semitic purposes. The examples he brings out, the instructions of Amenhotep, in very general terms, Jewish culture and religious adaptation of Egyptian materials may be illustrated by the parallels between the instructions of Amenhotep and portions of the book of Proverbs.